A weathered rancher had dwelled in solitude for 8 quiet years until a wounded Navajo woman rapped on his door, pleading for shelter. He rescued her, yet the secret she bore might scorch his entire existence to ashes. If you're craving more gripping frontier romance and peril tales like this one, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. All right, let's dive in. For 8 endless years, Jack Harlan had existed in utter quiet on his isolated New Mexico spread, miles from settlements, miles from clamor, miles from anything that echoed the world he'd left behind. His spouse's passing had crushed him, carving out a vacant shell who drowned himself in labor and habit. Dawn brew, tending steers, mending barriers, gazing at dusk skies. His routine was steady, barren, secure. He conversed with nobody, entertained no callers, and grew accustomed to the sting of seclusion like it was woven into the soil. But that season's chill bit deeper than any prior. Gales sliced over the grasslands like blades, icing water holes solid, turning every task into a skirmish. On one such evening, with overcast skies eclipsing the moon and the homestead shrouded in shadow, Jack hunkered by his modest blaze, attuned solely to the snap of flaming logs. The frost clawed at the panes, and he tugged his faded jacket snugger over his frame, figuring the darkness would slip by as soundlessly as every other had across the years. Then it sounded. 3 gentle raps. Not boisterous, not wild, but urgent. Jack stiffened, the noise alien after countless months of aloneness. No soul trespassed his territory. No horseman neared unannounced. No kinfolk ventured this distant without cause. Tension coiling, he rose and grasped the shotgun slung by the entrance. A second tap echoed, feebler than before, as though whoever lingered outside had scant vigor remaining. Jack eased the door ajar, braced for threat, but the sight that greeted him left him reeling. A lady lingered there, a Navajo lady, drenched by sleet, her locks plastered to her cheeks, her exhales quivering in the biting chill. Her garb was scant, ripped from the trek, and her form quaked without cease. She glanced up at him, gaze broad and beseeching, words failing her, yet plainly seeking heat, haven, endurance. For an instant, silence held them. The gale bellowed at her back, pressing him to choose swiftly. Jack wasn't one to rely on outsiders, particularly in the untamed territories where peril often masqueraded as the harmless. He wavered, thoughts tumbling through a cascade of grim outcomes. But the dread in her stare wasn't forged in guile. It was the dread of one who'd fled too long, weathered too fiercely. A tenderness stirred in his core, an emotion he'd reckoned interred for good. He set the shotgun down and moved apart, offering the modest grace she craved. She stepped in haltingly, frail, thankful, scarcely upright. Within, Jack steered her to the hearth. She crumpled to her haunches by it, stretching shivering palms to the glow. He draped a thick wool throw over her back, observing as she labored for air. Her features were wind-scorched, marred, etched by fatigue. Jack passed her a mug of steaming soup, and she sipped it like she hadn't known comfort in ages. Only after a drawn-out hush did she muster her name. Lena, her tone faint, tentative, laced with the lilt of her kin's speech. Jack knelt nearby, straining to grasp how she'd washed up at his threshold in the dead of night, leagues from any Navajo outpost. She strove to recount, blending her halting English with motions. Though her phrases fractured, the essence shone through. She'd trudged miles amid frost and tempest, hunting refuge. Each time a term eluded him, Jack inclined his head softly, coaching her onward. He didn't prod. He didn't challenge her right to tremble. He just heard her out, a skill he'd forsaken with fellow beings long ago. As the blaze thawed her flesh and the cover swaddled her close, a flush crept back to her skin. Jack caught himself scrutinizing her in the wavering glow. Her resilience, her fatigue, her resolve to endure. She was youthful, yet bore the burden of one who'd confronted excess trials. I pondered what shadows pursued her, what terror she'd witnessed, and why his spread of every spot had become her breaking point. But I held my tongue. Dusk wasn't primed for revelations. Instead, I fed the flames brighter, guaranteeing the hut remained toasty. I tendered her fresh attire, and though she paused, reserved and wary, she took it. I averted my eyes as she slipped it on, peering into the downpour, lashing the glass. This evening carried an odd weight, like destiny had meandered over the Badlands and tapped at his latch. My quarters, once still, barren and void, now pulsed with another's rhythm. It rattled me, yet it soothed a solitude I'd worn like a shadow. When Lena at last eased into the seat by the embers, lids drooping with weariness, I sensed a flutter in my breast I scarcely recalled. Care, duty, a connection. She wasn't safe, not from the freeze, not from the force that had hurled her into the gale, and not from the hazards of the borderlands. But here, amid these timbered bounds, she stood solitary no more, and nor did I. Jack perched opposite, limbs crossed, guarding her as she nodded off and roused, the hearth's gleam playing softly over her visage. Beyond, the squall wailed. Within, for the first time in 8 years, coziness permeated the space, not merely from the blaze, but from another's essence. Jack comprehended, as he tracked Lena's gentle breaths, that this twilight had altered a core within him. An unfamiliar had materialized at his stoop, soliciting a humble boon of heat, but unwittingly, she'd delivered something grander. She'd roused a spirit he deemed perished ages past, leaving him musing on what morn might unveil, and precisely who Lena truly was. By daybreak, the hut had thawed, and so had the quiet between them. Jack steeped Java, while Lena lingered by the hearth, cocooned in that same wool throw that had warded off the deadly cold. Rays seeped through the narrow casement, brushing her countenance tenderly, exposing shadowed rings under her eyes, badges of restless vigils and endless trails. Jack divined that the load she harbored ran weightier than the maelstrom she'd fled. A strain hung in the air, not menacing, but delicate, like a confession poised on the brink. He offered her a tin of hot water and lingered in stillness. It demanded moments before she summoned the fortitude to voice it. Her temper quavered initially, not from the bite, but from recollection. She laid it out in fractured English, weaving Navajo terms, signs, and breaths, but the import crystallized. Her settlement had endured a savage raid by a band of renegades prowling the wastes, seizing all they fancied. They'd torched dwellings, rustled herds, and gunned down resistors. Lena had crouched behind a toppled log as infernos devoured her world. She'd bolted when the cries ebbed, when haze choked the heavens, when motion ceased elsewhere. Jack attended, his chin clenching with each syllable. The territories were brutal, but her account transcended savagery. It was carnage. She shared how she'd hiked 2 days sans sustenance, trailing constellations, shunning paths, dreading the bandits would track fleeing remnants. No kin remained, no hamlet to reclaim, no comrades to lean on. When she noted she'd caught word that rancher Jack Harlan stood apart, that he'd aided a Navajo fellow when others balked, Jack felt an odd pang in his ribs. A kindness lingered in memory. Faith had drawn her here. Her tone splintered whenever she evoked the blaze, yet her essence held steadfast. Jack revered that fortitude. She mourned, fractured, yet unbreakable. He glimpsed valor beneath her unease, a silent drive to persist. It kindled within him, not merely an urge to shield her, but to align at her side. For 8 years he'd inhabited a husk of sorrow, uttering only the essentials. Now, as he absorbed Lena's tale, dialogue flowed back to him effortlessly, as if isolation had eased just enough to permit a full inhale. But each disclosure she imparted dragged the shadow of peril she toted. The marauders who'd razed her home lurked near. They moved swift, spared no traces, and felled any who harbored their quarry.
Jack knew they'd scour the border trails, homesteads, outposts, any nook a remnant might seek. Should they find her on his grounds, they'd spare no qualms. They'd raise his quarters, slaughter his stock, and drop him cold. Aiding her spelled electing a course that might raise all he'd pieced together post his beloved's demise. Lena perceived his fret. Her gaze dropped, chagrined at dragging peril to the sole gent who'd not barred her. She murmured she'd depart if he desired, that she sought no curse upon him, but her words wavered as she uttered them, bearing the profundity of her dread at re-entering the barren wilds. She was resilient, aye, but drained, stalked, and adrift. Jack discerned she wouldn't weather another eve solo, not with brigands afoot, not with wintry blasts turning lethal, not with her lacerated soles and waning vigor. Jack drew nearer, eyeing her as she fixed on the planks, clutching the throw like her last bulwark against fate. For a stretched beat he held mute. He mulled his wife, the oaths he'd sworn to safeguard existence, not evade it. He reflected on the barren spans he'd borne, yearning for aim, for meaning, for a nudge that his pulse yet beat. Lena hadn't sought him by chance. The universe had nudged her to his portal on the lone eve he craved a spark to feel vital once more. When she at length raised her sights and queried, scarce above a hush, "Might I remain till the threat ebbs?" Jack sensed his response surge, ere second thoughts could meddle. He beheld not a Navajo lady lading him with hazard, but a kindred essence battling to persist, a remnant clinging to a slender strand of hopefulness. Without delay, he voiced the assurance she required, and the one he craved deeper still. "You're safe here as long as it takes." That pledge lingered like an oath, binding their paths as one. Lena's eyes brimmed with ease, and for the first instance, she permitted a true, deep draw of air. Jackknife felt the strain melt from her frame. She wasn't wholly protected, not quite, but isolation gripped her no longer. He led her to the narrow cot in the nook, urged repose, and turned to his stores. He verified his scatterguns gleamed, his mount geared, his lamps brimming. If menace loomed, he'd stand primed. He'd tarried too long without direction, and now fate had bestowed one to guard the being it had entrusted to his care. As Lena slept, Jack eased onto the veranda's lip, scanning the vast meadows. The dawn orb ascended languorly, thawing the rime-draped blades. He felt a pivot deep in his marrow, a flicker, a resolution, a resurgence of the fellow he'd once been. The cutthroats were unaware yet, but should they prowl for her, they'd encounter no frail herder. They'd meet a soul with naught to forsake and a cause meriting the fray anew. In that serene interlude, Jack grasped that helping Lena didn't pose a yoke. It marked the dawn of recapturing the days he'd mourned as gone for A.